I've seen in quite some time. It was truly amazing. Lights and stuff all over the place. It was Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas all together in 2 amazing rows of stuff to be bought. It's going to be a long season, folks. There are times when we all need our perspectives adjusted. Personal stories help us gain that perspective. We all like to hear stories. And I'll tell you a little story about myself from the other day. I'm seeing a nutritionist this year, helping me to work on a new way of eating and a new way of living, and making sure there's not too much carbs and all this. And I was getting down on myself because I'd reached a certain point. I'd made just so much progress in the stuff. And I was, you know how you get when you reach that point. You start picking on every little thing and you get the negative attitude. And she just looked at me and laughed and she said, No, you're doing so many things right. You're building for the future. You're changing your habits. He said, I don't care if you haven't lost a pound. If you're doing all that, you're going to be all right. I hadn't thought of it that way. Totally new perspective. Amazing. Changed the way I was thinking about things. And that's the power of this particular story today, because we've got a story from Paul to Timothy. And Timothy's a new minister. He's just getting into the business. And so the old expert's taking him aside and saying, here's some things you ought to know. Now let me tell you a story. Now this is quite the story. Paul speaks of his personal story and how he was changed by being received by Jesus. And he calls all of us to join in his journey, join in his story in a way. It's a beautiful tale. And it has been inspiring renewed faith in people for generations. Now it's our turn. Paul tells a story that most leaders who had really arrived, who had a lot of followers, who gained a lot of influence, a lot of churches, would have swept under the rug. This is not the story they want to get out. But Paul, instead, for the encouragement of his new minister Timothy, and for everyone who would read this later, he comes clean. He says his power, his faith, his courage are all from Christ Jesus our Lord, who he acknowledges strengthens him and appointed him for service. We can do the same today. We can reflect on our faith in the modern world, telling a part of our story to other people, just a part of what Jesus has done for us. Don't want to tell them so much their eyes start to glaze over, or they start saying too much information and backing away. But enough to be inspirational. Be an inspiration for others. Witnessing like that is powerful. It's inspirational for folks to do more when they hear what you have done. The same goes with Paul here. He begins his story in a very healthy place. He begins with gratitude to Jesus for all that Jesus has done for him. Gratitude is always a wonderful place to start. And he goes on with humility. He gives Jesus credit for all of it. He doesn't take any credit. I did this, I did. No, Jesus did this through me. And then he follows with brutal honesty. Brutal honesty, because he describes his life as Saul before he became Paul. Actually, Saul was his first name, Paul is his middle name, he switched. He says, I was so bad. I was a blasphemer, I was a persecutor, I was a man of violence. Have you ever felt that you were too bad, or that you lacked in some essential ingredient that would keep you from doing any significant work in Christianity? You're saying, I am so awful, Jesus could never accept me. Perhaps Timothy was feeling that way. He's beginning his ministry. He's overwhelmed. Paul wanted to show that even the people he'd been talking about earlier, who were doing things very wrong in his mind, people who were teaching myths instead of reality. People who were going endlessly over genealogies, speculating over instead of using divine training. They skipped that phase. They were meaninglessly discussing things over and over again. They desired to be teachers of the law, but they didn't understand what the law said. And they took strong positions on it when they didn't have a clue what they were talking about. He said, even these folks who exasperated him no end, he said, they are not beyond redemption. Again, look at me. Jesus came to save sinners, Paul asserts, and Jesus still does. We are not beyond redemption either, none of us. Jesus was Saul's cure. Saul becomes Paul through receiving mercy and grace and patience from Jesus. And we can too. Have you ever thought of patience as being a key ingredient to your faith journey from God or from Jesus to you, giving you time to do what you need to do? He was cured of zealotry, Saul was, which is extreme fanaticism, which led to blasphemy, persecution, and violence. And what is persecution? Well, this is a serious matter. Persecution is an aggressiveness and a willingness to do violent harm to others. It's a behavior that's carried out in a truly hostile spirit. There's no fruit of the Spirit involved in persecution. It's done by people who have a fiery zeal that is described as being not based on knowledge, but on their emotion. It is an exercise in terror. This was Saul. This is who he was. But from all of this, Jesus saved Saul. He became Paul. Nobody's beyond Jesus' reach. No one. Paul considered himself an example of hope. If a hot mess like him could be redeemed by Jesus, anybody could, no matter what their sins. They might receive Jesus' mercy too. It's the hope of every generation. And if you don't believe what you've heard so far, let me tell you a story from Christianity Today written by a man named Thomas Terrence. Now, Thomas Terrence, as a young man, went seriously, deeply astray. He had a bad family life. He was living in Alabama in the time of segregation when integration was just coming in, and there was all sorts of strong, angry emotions, and he slid right on into the hands of the Klan. And he reached a point in his hatred of others that he went out with a small squad and a bomb. And they went to the home of a Jewish businessman, and they were trying to set that bomb up when the police showed up, and a gunfight ensued. And he was shot down. He was taken to the hospital, and the doctors looked at him and said, frankly, son, you have about 45 minutes to live. But then they operated on him. And he said, a miracle from God occurred. He said, to the amazement of the doctors and the disappointment of the police officers, I lived. And they sent him to prison. And in prison he escaped with a small group of violent convicts. And one night, he had been standing watch, and he was relieved. He said, an hour after I was relieved, the person on watch, the police caught up with us, a gunfight ensued again, and he was shot down, and said it would have been me if I'd still been on watch. So I would have reacted just as violently. They put him in isolation. And first in isolation, he read the Klan tracts that were available to him. But he got tired of that. And he found the New Testament. And he started reading the New Testament. Well, he began to change right then and there, because as he read daily, a new sin of his was brought up to him every single day. And he repented of that. He moved on to the next. He dropped to his knees. He prayed for forgiveness. He gave his life over to Jesus. And when they released him from that isolation cell, he was not the same person who had gone in. He made friends amongst people very different from himself, people he'd been taught to hate. He had friends among black inmates. He had made friends with the FBI agent who had captured him. He made friends with a Jewish lawyer who was trying to help him. All people that he had been taught before were his enemies. He was a transformed man. He was entirely changed. And he said, then 8 years later, he said, these things take time. He said, he's working in God's time, not ours. He says, 8 years later, another miracle occurred. He says, I was brought up for parole. I said, I never expected that. He says, he was released on parole so he could attend university. And while he was at university, he fell in with a Christian organization. He followed that through, and when he graduated from seminary, when graduated from the university, he went on to seminary, and he became a pastor of a multi-racial church. And he was there for many years. He's now professor emeritus at the C.S. Lewis Institute. He said, honestly, he said, I felt I deserved to die back then for what I had done. But as you can see, Paul was right. With patience, love, and mercy, people can be forgiven. People can be transformed. Just as Saul became Paul. Besides gratitude, humility, and honesty, Paul also draws strength from Christ for his ministry. No matter what hurdles he faced, he relied on the strength of Jesus. How many times have we faced a situation where we've been afraid to speak up because we're afraid we didn't know the facts, we're going to say something wrong, especially if we were faced with someone who was strident, who really presented their information in a very strong way. How many times have we been afraid to try something new for fear that we won't be up to the task? For fear that we'll make some critical mistake and fail. Paul put aside his fears. He spoke up. The funny thing is he wasn't an orator. Orators are supposed to have deep, booming voices. Apparently his was kind of reedy. The kind of man he was supposed to be was somebody who could upbraid people to their faces, say, shame, don't you do that anymore. He couldn't do that. In some of his letters he said, please don't make me be that way when I come and see you. Please change by the time I get to you from reading this letter, because I don't want to do that. It makes me uncomfortable. And yet there he was, the most powerful evangelist in early Christianity, because he drew his strength from Jesus. And he kept going forward no matter what he faced. He had a truly amazing ministry. So we can follow Paul's example. We can take strength from Jesus as well. And all that we say and all that we do. Again, Paul states that all things he did were through Jesus. This was not self-aggrandizing. There was no chest pounding here. There's no, I did this all myself. No, it all belongs to Jesus. It's worth pausing here, too, to reflect on where Jesus has met us along the paths of our lives. Where have we had encounters along the road? What have we been called to do by Christ? What way may we be being called to do now by Jesus? Look through the Bible and tell me if you can find anybody who had a retirement plan as far as God is concerned. Surely, we will be transformed just as Paul's life was transformed when we accept those calls. And what could we do with them? What would be our response? Well, we can respond as Paul responded, glorifying God. Now, what does that mean? That means reflecting God's greatness in all that we think, all that we feel, and all that we do each and every day. If we do that over time, we become transformed. We become different people than we were. We're bending towards God's way of doing things, God's way of seeing the world and seeing other people, the ways that Jesus pointed to throughout his ministry. And what happens to us when we're transformed, it makes us light in a darkened world. It draws people towards what we are doing and how we are, because we're different from those around us. We have something to offer they can't get anywhere else. And we get to celebrate the love and the patience and the grace of God in our lives. And we respond well to that, doing what Jesus wants us to do, glorifying God in the process, making lives better, sharing the stories of what Jesus has done for us along the way, and inspiring people with those fascinating stories. Paul told his story, and he encourages us to tell ours, and encourages us to live into his story of faith, his journey, and his ministry, in whatever way we are talented to do that. And when you're different, and when you're persistent at it, people notice. You might not know that they notice, but they do. For instance, Tom Hagen, my sister-in-law Marty's brother, he was an avid runner. He ran 10 miles each and every day, no matter the weather. No matter the weather. And when he ran, he was invariably kind to everyone he met along the way. And the neighbors noticed this over the years. He did this for at least a decade. And when he was killed in an accident on his bicycle, well, all those neighbors who he'd inspired got together. And they went to the site of the accident, and they started walking, and they walked all the way to Marty and my brother Mark's house. And they held a memorial service there in honor of the walking man. That's how they thought about it. And the wonderful life and the way he had inspired all of them by his persistence and his kindness. The running man, excuse me, not the walking man. He ran, he didn't walk. I walked, he ran. And we don't need to worry about making mistakes as we try some new way to glorify God. No, we shouldn't sweat that, because as Father Greg Boyle, a friar who'd been sent to an LA parish years ago that was located between two gang-filled housing projects, says from experience, he says there really are no mistakes. They're all lessons to be learned from instead. And we change people by doing things with them, for them. He said, he tells you one story about Louis, a 19-year-old gang member who made his money by selling crack cocaine to drivers as they went past. And of course, as often happens in those cases, he became his own best customer. He got hooked, and for a long time, Greg tried to get him into rehab. And I couldn't do it for him, but I could keep trying. He says, and one day he decided to go. Louis decided to go into rehab. And he said a month later, an awful thing happened. His younger brother, a fellow gang member, took his own life. He says this is extraordinarily rare amongst gang members. Usually they walk into enemy territory and hope somebody will do the job for them. And he said, I had to tell Louis about this. He says, it's very worrisome, because when something that tragic happens in a life, there's usually a setback and somebody falls back into their old ways. And he says, Louis, I'll make you a deal. I'll pick you up, I'll take you to the funeral, but right after that, I'm taking you right back to rehab. He said, he says, that's fine with me, because I like how it feels being clean. I like it in rehab. And so he got into the car to go to the funeral, and he turned to Greg Boyle in tears, and he said, I had a dream last night. He said, you were in it. We were sitting together in the dark. There was no light in the room. There was no cracked light under the door or any window anywhere. It was pitch black. We were sitting in utter silence, side by side. He said, and suddenly you pulled a flashlight out of your pocket, Father Greg. And you pointed it across the room, and you turned on the light, and there was a light switch on the other side of the room, and I knew in that moment only I could switch on the light. Louis said I was scared, but I got up and I followed the light to the switch on the wall. And I threw that switch, and the room was flooded with light. And he cried and he sobbed. And he said, and the light is better than the darkness. This was a truth that Louis had never known until that moment. Boyle says we can't switch on the lights for anyone, but we all have our flashlights. We can all aim them for each other to the switch on the wall. Boyle advises from experience. He says, don't go to people on the margins where Jesus calls us to go, the struggling people of the world. If you're going to go there with a specific message to deliver or a specific way you think you're going to save them, because then it's just about you. And if you do that, you'll simply hurt yourself. You will burn out. You will fail. He says, go to the margins to love people, to meet them where they are, to learn who they are, to work with them, to help them find a better way, to use your flashlight to guide them. It's what Jesus did. It's what Paul did. And both of them ended up glorifying God by what they did. You're looking for a way to do that? I just saw an article. A sad little article talking about millennials, people aged 23 to 38. He said 30% of millennials are lonely, 20% of millennials say they have no friends. And they say that loneliness increases with age. And it's associated with higher blood pressure and inflammation, which can lead to heart disease and cancer. Perhaps some of us will be called to help counter that loneliness in others, to meet them where they are, to listen to them, to befriend them in some way or another and break through that loneliness. Paul gave us a beautiful model to follow. We can be grateful for what Jesus has done for us. We can be humble, pointing to Jesus as the source of our strength and our faith and our salvation. We can love others and meet them where they are, get to know them, share their stories that we have about how Jesus met us, and listen to their stories in return. We can lean on Jesus' strength. We don't need to be afraid. When we do all that, we can just see what happens. Let's pause for a moment of silent reflection. At the end of the service, during the last hymn, if anybody wishes to come forward and give their life to Christ, come up and see me after the hymn will talk. Let's pause for a moment of silent reflection. Please rise for our hymn of praise, number 56.